So finally got around to completing turn number 19. And just to take suspense out, the game will continue into turn 20, which is January 46. I rolled a 6 on the 12-sided die to end the game, and I needed a 5. So the game just barely continues. And the Axis continue to have a firm grip on this game. There's really not much of any chance the Allies have. And the Comintern is even in worse shape than the Allies. Although, if the game was to continue, probably would need to continue about a minimum of 2, if not 3 more turns. The Allies are making some moves in the Pacific, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But in Europe, things are pretty bleak for the Allies and the Comintern. So the Germans went ahead and they continue to push deeper into Russia. So they're closing in on the relocated Russian capital. They're just one territory shy of being adjacent to that. So Novosibirsk is where the Russians relocated their capital, and they've tried to build up some decent forces there. They've got a stack of about 8 infantry, about 4 or 5 mechanized, a fighter, a couple of heavy armor, and a couple of medium armor. But the Italians helped the Germans out on their portion of the turn, and they took this territory adjacent to Novosibirsk. So now the Germans can move up one territory, this territory here the Italians occupy, and they can bring their entire air force up there and land there. So by doing that, not only will they be at the doorstep to Novosibirsk on the following turn if the game was to continue, but now that the Germans can bring all their aircraft in here because Italy already owns that territory, it's less likely the Russians will either try or would be successful to attack Germany here, because the Germans are going to be able to move this entire force up, which is a couple cavalry, a couple of light armor, about 4 medium armor, about 5 infantry and artillery. These couple of medium armor will also be able to reach, and there's 2 stacks of about 6 Stukas that'll all be able to reach. So it would probably be fairly close. I think the Germans would have the advantage, but so that's probably what Germany's going to do on this turn, is move up here to this Italian-held territory and then make a play for Novosibirsk on the following turn if the game goes that long, and eliminate the second Russian capital. Besides that, the Germans did buy a couple of paratroopers that they put in Berlin. They already still had a couple of transports from earlier in the game, so now the Germans are going to try to make a play maybe for some of the home territories in Britain itself. The Germans also came up here and took out the British force that was in this northern Russian territory. They took that back for themselves. They only had a single medium armor left and a couple of fighters, but it was a stack of, I believe, about 10 British infantry they ejected off of Russian territory. And then the other move is the Germans did come down. If you remember, this probably was the biggest battle of the game so far, not in terms of importance, but just in terms of units involved. The Germans came down into this French territory. I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly. A Quintine maybe. The British owned that, and in that territory was a bunch of both British and American units. I can't remember exactly what was in there, but there was probably roughly about 15 to 18 infantry, about a half a dozen medium armor, I think a medium bomber, a handful of tactical bombers, and a bunch of fighters, probably altogether about a dozen or so fighters. And the Germans did come in. They brought in a stack of probably upwards of 20 tanks, upwards of about 15 fighters, about 20 mechanized infantry, a couple, I think 1 infantry, and like 3 or 4 artillery. And the Allies got some really good rolls. They forced the Germans to retreat. The Germans were down to what's left in Paris, which retreated. So that's about 8 medium armor, and about 6 fighters. So the Germans lost all their mechanized, at least half their fighters, at least half of their medium armor. So they pulled back. And at the time that they pulled back, the Allies still had altogether probably about a dozen fighters, I think a couple of armor, and maybe some infantry. So the odds were in the Allies' favor, plus the Germans were just going to continue to lose expensive units. They didn't have any infantry cannon fodder left to sacrifice as casualties. So the Germans actually pulled back to Paris. They moved this big stack of about 15 mechanized infantry up from West Germany. So now that is a position to go down into that French territory on this next turn. So then, having seen that, the Allies knew there was no way they were going to be able to withstand a second German assault on this turn. So they pulled out of there. The British retreated their fighters to London. They also built 5 infantry, seeing as the Germans bought those Fallschirmjäger. They also pulled back from the last northern Russian territory that they were in. It only consists of 2 infantry and then just this pretty sizable British fleet, about a half a dozen transports, 4 destroyers, a couple light and a couple heavy cruisers, and a light carrier. But there was no point in the British staying. They've just got the 2 infantry. There's no way that would have even remotely been enough to withstand a German assault. So they pulled everything back, not sure what they're going to do with this force. Not a lot for them to do with it. Maybe bring the Navy and try to get down into the Mediterranean if the game goes that long and challenge the Italians, because the Germans right now don't have any naval units on the board. So not a lot for that British fleet to do. The Americans, they are bringing their fleet that was off of the coast of Spain back to the United States. A couple of heavy cruisers, about 8 destroyers, and about a half a dozen transports making their way back to the East Coast to pick up some U.S. infantry. And then the U.S. forces that were in Quintain came down into Spain, so they pretty much occupied almost all of Spain. The Italians are down to just 3 artillery. The U.S. have about 5 medium armor, 5 infantry, and about a half a dozen fighters in Spain itself. So they should finish off the conquest of Spain this turn. But the Germans also have their units in Paris that can start coming down as well. So I'm not sure how long the U.S. will be able to hold Spain. As far as the Italians, they continue to work on rebuilding their navy. They put down a couple more destroyers and a couple of more transports. So now they've got about 8 infantry that they can move on these 4 transports next turn to land into Spain to kind of fight back against the Americans. And they've got a pretty substantial fleet altogether. They got a couple of battleships, a coastal sub, a fleet carrier, 4 destroyers, and the 4 transports. They also put down another fleet carrier and a battleship on position 1 on the production chart. Down in Africa, the Italians just took Sudan. Wasn't worth anything, but didn't have anything for this cavalry unit to do, so he came over, took that. And Africa is now completely under Axis control between the Vichy, the Japanese, and the Italians, minus territories that have no IPP value. So Africa is now completely Axis. In the Pacific, Japan has definitely got their hands full. They spent money on trying to build a little bit of a navy backup, not so much to challenge what America can put in the Pacific Ocean, because the U.S. collects so much more money, but just mostly to be able to get these infantry in Tokyo and move them around, maybe landing them in China. So they've got 3 light carriers, 3 destroyers, and 5 transports. They also might come down and eject the Americans from this Japanese home territory. In China itself, the CCP are definitely on the move. They're now into original Japanese territory in Manchuria. They took Rihe, and there's not really much to stop them from moving into adjacent Japanese territories. Down in Southeast Asia, the CCP built 5 cavalry They also move their planes down a position so they can actually maybe start coming into India this next turn. And they own all of China. And they've moved some units onto the coast, the Chinese coast, so that at least the Japanese wouldn't have an unopposed landing if they decided to land somewhere back in China. The Japanese did bring their transports and an empty light carrier back from South Africa trying to get over here. But Japan doesn't really have a lot going on. They still have a decent income with bonuses and the income die roll. They're still probably collecting upwards of $60. But again, they've got their hands full with both the Comintern and the Allies coming at them from a bunch of different directions. And then the Australians down in the South Pacific started liberating the Money Islands. They took 2 of them back this turn. So Japan's going to probably have to bring down their light carriers. The planes will launch from those along with these 2 subs here. They've at least got to take out the Australian transports so that Australia can't take any more of the Money Islands. And then at that point, have these Australian infantry stranded on these islands and maybe pick them off down the road. So Australia definitely presenting some problems for the Japanese in the South Pacific. And then the U.S. put down a bunch of ships off of the West Coast here in San Francisco. They already had 3 destroyers. They put down 3 light cruisers, 3 heavy cruisers, 2 fleet carriers, which have 3 fighters and a tactical bomber on there. So the U.S. did that for a couple reasons. Now they have the victory point for having twice the capital ships in the Pacific as the Japanese, but then also seeing as how the Japanese don't have much of a navy. This fleet already is more than what Japan has. So the U.S., if the game continues maybe a couple more turns, the U.S. can then take control of the Pacific, maybe even start building up some transports to get some men, maybe to threaten Japan itself. As far as the income tracker, we've got Germany is again far in the lead. They're collecting $100 minus bonuses, so they get a ridiculous amount of money. Japan $44, Italy staying pretty strong at $20 because they also get $6 worth of bonuses plus the wartime economy rolls. And then as far as the Comintern and the Allies, the U.S. still pretty strong at 66. The CCP's in good shape at 19, but Britain's down to just 17. Russia's down to just 11. Australia's doing pretty decent for them at 9. The tech charts, obviously, were late in the game, so a lot of the countries have completed a bunch of different tech, especially if you look at Germany. They've completed, 5, 10 techs. The U.S. has completed 11. So both the U.S. and the Germans lead the way in terms of tech. And then as far as the victory points go, the Axis, again, far in the lead. They're at 18. The Comintern fell 1 down to 6. The Allies actually moved up 1 to 7. But as you can see, the Comintern and Allies combined are still significantly behind the Axis. So I don't really expect that to change too much. I think with each turn that goes by, the chances of the game ending on the die roll increase. So unless the Allies get extremely lucky and have the game continue for a while, I don't think they're going to be able to make a comeback. And even then, they really have no chance in Europe. It's only in the Pacific, taking on the Japanese, that the Allies can really make any significant gains.